Hello Giants fans, welcome to Giants Baseball 101. I'm Gabe Vaughn, your host. So what we're going to do tonight is essentially a part 2 of what we were talking about last night. Just reflecting on the firing of President of Baseball Operations Farhan Zaidi, the errors, the huge errors of the previous administration, and what that means for us now. So, first, it's just essentially a bit of review. Zaidi came in and he was ready to be unconventional, ready to use his analytics-driven style, but he couldn't keep that in connection with, in any way, with how things had been for the Giants when they were actually winning championships. And Zaidi was really picking up on what he learned a couple of decades ago in what was just popular between 2000 and 2010. And when he worked for the A's, that's where he picked up a lot of that. Prior to that, when he was in college, he read Moneyball. We know how Zaidi kind of got started and why he values the things that he values. And before you think I'm saying that this new strategy thing can't make a team better than what it would otherwise be, I'm not. What I'm saying is that what was previously the ceiling is now the floor. Back in Billy Beane's day, and Zaidi did, I believe he interned for Beane and the Oakland A's, but it was really prior to that the revolution really began. It was finding the whole market inefficiencies. You put all that into numbers and find out how you can get better with a low budget. Those are the exact same ideas that Zaidi built up on. And I have no problem with that at all. It's just that it used to be the ceiling. Zaidi, with the Giants, he was treating it like it's the ceiling. In fact, it's the floor. Now, is it probably necessary to know the ins and outs of the whole complex analytics-driven strategy that they were using? Is it necessary for the San Francisco Giants to know those things? Yeah, and let's carry our illustration a step further. If you don't, it's like you'll be in the basement, because it's the floor, not the ceiling. It's the floor, but it is the floor and nothing less. You don't have that analytics-driven strategy, and you can't keep up with other teams on it. Where are you? You are in the basement. But guess what? There are 6 playoff spots in the National League. Only 6, and 6 in the American League. There are plenty of teams. There are going to be plenty of teams sitting out there on the floor who just aren't going to get in the playoffs. Just about every team, almost every team, with a very few, maybe exceptions, but the way I see it, just about every team that sits right there on that floor, even if they have some of the data-driven stuff, they're not going anywhere. And the teams that are willing to spend money, they quite obviously are still going to come out on top. If everybody knows the same amount of information, or any equivalent in its effectiveness, the teams that spend money, that are able to sign free agents and do all of that, maybe we could say old stuff, they're still going to come out on top. That really sums up just a lot of the whole previous administration's errors, the things we've been sitting through for 6 full years now. And I'm not, this is just one example here. I do not doubt and will not dispute in any way that Zaidi's administration, that he did a great job finding, just one example, finding Kevin Gossman and signing him, and during his stint with the Giants, just the impact they got out of him. I would not argue that. I would not dispute that in any way. Here's the problem. In the 2021 offseason, his contract expired, and who did he sign with? Who did he sign a huge deal with? That's the point. Did they re-sign him? No, they didn't. They found him when his stint with the Giants was over. And he didn't say after the 2021 season he wasn't coming back to the Giants. He indicated nothing about not being open to re-signing with them. And the Giants didn't re-sign him. So it's either they can't negotiate, they're not willing to spend money. It's a combination. Honestly, it's a combination of everything. But I think we better take this from the top. Even as far back as 2019, and that's where I think that the reasonable thing to do was just have an unbiased standpoint. It was, everybody had to kind of have an unbiased look at it. It seemed like the way Zaidi was doing it, at least it was putting together a good rebuilding plan for the future. I think legitimately good rebuilding plan. This was back in 2019, but even there, from the beginning, wasn't it easy to tell that there was some weird roster stuff going on? And I'm going to explain something here that there's just a simple reason why people will not catch on to this. Why nobody caught on to this. And it's because there's a decent term that can be used for this to sometimes cover up what's really going on. I hope you're following. I'll explain what I'm talking about in a minute. But what we're dealing with, and it has to do just with the roster in general, there's a term for this that just lends so much decency to it that nobody will think about what's going on. The roster in 2019, even that far back, kind of started to go haywire, and it was almost like you were always sending down, calling up, and kind of making changes, and it was just hard to see a full, kind of sticking roster identity there. There was so much kind of weird shifting and changing, and that included guys coming in and out on waivers, I believe, on a few occasions, and it just, long story short, it was easy to tell that it was just unconventional. Now, there's a term that just lends such respectability to this, and it's called roster flexibility. That term is used among baseball minds, and it will easily, in most cases, it'll quiet anybody who dares to question whether things need to constantly be so liquid all the time, and why it's impossible to just kind of settle with a roster, a depth chart, and but that's kind of what started this thing. It was, people got moved so much, and it was just like a new way of doing things. I know I'm not going into a lot of detail explaining this, but I mean, you get the point. It was called, or I'm sure it was thought of as roster flexibility. It's like we have a lot of roster flexibility. That's the term, and it just hides the ugly side of just an inconsistency and an inability to just kind of maintain a solid roster. And I'm just going to give one. This is just one kind of extreme example of what was going on. The lefty relief pitcher they took in the Rule 5 draft in the offseason prior to the 2019 regular season, the lefty reliever Travis Bergen, he was the guy that they took in the Rule 5 draft. And for those not familiar, Rule 5 picks, if they're added to the roster, would have to either stay on the roster without being optioned or anything the entire season, or they must be offered back to the team they were taken from at half the price that was paid to get them. Hope that makes sense. But essentially, he needed to stay on the big league roster. He was a permanent big leaguer for that season because he was a Rule 5 pick. Well, he made the 2019 opening day roster, but I believe it was in May of 2019, he was put on the injured list with a shoulder strain. Now, at the time of the injury, Berggren actually said he would play through that thing if it were a pennant race or anything like that. He just wanted to take extreme precautions, so he was kind of complying with going on the injured list, but it wasn't serious. He'd play through it if it was a pennant race or playoffs or whatever, he said. But it's not like he came off the 10-day injured list in 10 days. Oh no. He actually ended up getting transferred to the 60-day injured list. Now maybe got worse all of a sudden, you know. You never know what goes on behind the scenes. Rehabbing is always tough for players. Sometimes injuries are worse than they seem. But I think it would be fair enough to ask the question, was it really a shoulder strain or was it maybe a roster spot strain? What was the real injury? What was the issue? If it was a roster spot strain, you know, you're wanting that extra spot for utility players or maybe a spot starter if you have a reason to call someone up to make a start and that kind of thing. So I mean, having to manage it that way, honestly, where you got a Rule 5 going to the injured list, it probably at least shows some just instability there. And it was unstable roster, call it flexible or whatever you want to. It's kind of where things started, and it looked weird. And strategy has kind of been unconventional, like all throughout. So, again, some things are better than others, like going back to the original point, like relying on analytical evaluation is one thing, and it's what we're calling it here. It's necessary to stay afloat. It's not sufficient to gain a competitive advantage and beat out your competition. So you don't want to be the super underdog at the bottom of the league. Well, the Giants were not that in any one of their years of Zaidi's tenure. They were possible playoff contenders every single year, but in these 6 years, they only made the playoffs once, and it's fairly easy to see why. So that's what's happening here. And just looking at the philosophy of executives across the game, it's analytical reliance can be great when you also at least know how to negotiate, when you at least know how to use it. So instead of having Zaidi at the helm, I would far rather have someone like Theo Epstein, who was a longtime GM. I believe he's holding a different role now. Epstein is a great respecter of analytics, but he also has a business background. He knows the business of the game. He could sign guys to long contracts and actually negotiate. Epstein would be a guy who knows the business of the game, and I would imagine too that he would do a far better job understanding the background and culture of a particular team. And I would honestly, we'll take it a step further. I would rather have, as an executive, I would rather have a guy like him than even Buster Posey. What are we waiting for? I'm not going to apologize for making a simple statement of fact. Not going to ask Theo Epstein to swing a bat or put on a catcher's glove. No. But understand what I'm saying. As an executive, president of baseball operations, like, I'm just giving an example of kind of the ideal type where you use numbers, you use analytics and stuff, but you don't try to make it fit into a strategy of inactivity and trying to do it without superstar talent. You got to blend it. Got to use it with superstar talent. That's the only reason I brought that up. So if we're gonna get anything out of what's going on here, I think it's just such a positive thing that, and I don't know how long it's going to take to change the current state of the Giants system. I mean, we understand when damage is done, sometimes there's a lot got to clean up after your previous administration. That may be the case here with the Giants. Still, I do have strong hopes that they will at least be legit playoff contenders in 2025. There's certainly a far better chance now after they've made the change that they've made. And so I think they've got a shot, and certainly I think a shot to do something really soon. It could make all the difference for them. Just, again, the strong positive with Posey is that he has a connection to the Giants in the years that they really should be thinking about, and that they should be thinking about getting back to, and structuring their team in a way that will get back to that. That's what we haven't been seeing for 6 years. It has not been happening for the past 6 years. That's what I'm hopeful that we're going to see with Buster Posey stepping into this role. However long he sticks around in it, or whether it does turn out that he's kind of an interim guy, but I think they do have big plans going forward with Buster Posey, and at the very least, he's got to have an understanding of what the team actually is supposed to look like. Thank you for watching. This has been Giants Baseball 101. Please subscribe if you haven't. Also, please leave your questions and comments. You know where to do it. I'll see you next time on Giants Baseball 101.